All right, ladies and gentlemen, chapter 28. So, a good place to start with chapter 28 is just to kind of zoom out a little bit and remind ourselves kind of where we are with regards to politics at this point in American history. So, I've said quite a few times already that between the years 1932 and 1968, it's kind of this reign of liberalism in the United States. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected in 1932 for the first time, and really just kind of completely reoriented the focus and the attention of the federal government. For the previous 12 years, we had been under Hoover. Um, Prior to Hoover was Coolidge. Prior to Coolidge was Harding. So 12 years of three conservative Republican presidents. Before that, we had the progressive era. But 1932, FDR comes in the middle of the Depression and basically unabashedly and aggressively dramatically increases the size and scope of the federal government, creates a whole bunch of government programs as part of the New Deal, doubles down on regulation of big business, banks, Wall Street, et cetera, and it kind of enters us into what we're talking about, this liberal era, this near 4 decade long era of liberalism, in which FDR is going to get elected 4 consecutive elections in 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1944, in which Harry Truman, a very liberal Democrat, is going to get elected in 1948, in which we'll see Dwight Eisenhower, who is a Republican but is basically politically nearly just as aligned with Truman, who was a Democrat, get elected in 1952 and 1956. And then in 60, JFK, who's quite liberal as a Democrat, John F. Kennedy will get elected. And then in 1964, Lyndon Johnson, who we will talk about a lot more in this chapter, will get elected. Then in 1968, we'll see a shift, which we'll talk about in this chapter as well. So that's kind of the context with which we need to understand where we've been. We're in the middle of this kind of long run of pretty strong liberal policy. Even though one Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, doesn't really do much to undo the New Deal. So as you recall, the New Deal was kind of built out by FDR during the Great Depression. Then once our economy kind of comes roaring back, a discussion kind of opens up where there's kind of three different perspectives on the New Deal, which is a very conservative perspective, which is, all right, now that the New Deal's over, now that the Great Depression's over, we don't need these programs anymore, so let's start to eliminate New Deal programs. That is a very unpopular sentiment during the 1950s and 1960s. Almost nobody agrees with that perspective. Then the other two perspectives are, then we either just need to maintain the New Deal as it is, keep all these programs around, keep them protected, keep them funded, keep them going, or expand it. And so far, what we've seen is between Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy, mostly just maintaining the New Deal, not really any efforts to get rid of it. Again, that's a very unpopular position, to get rid of these types of programs and to reduce the size of the federal government. We've basically gotten to a place where it's nearly universally accepted across the United States political landscape that the New Deal programs are here to stay, that they should not be dismantled, that this size of government is one that is generally accepted by most people in politics and most people in the United States. So whether we expand it or maintain it is kind of the question. And so far, between Truman and Eisenhower and JFK, we've mostly kind of just seen a maintenance of it. What we will see in this chapter under Lyndon Johnson is a very aggressive attempt to expand the New Deal and something that's going to be called the Great Society. Again, a lot more on that later on. So this chapter, chapter 28, is called The Uncivil Wars, Liberal Crisis and Conservative Rebirth. And basically what we're looking at is the decade of the 1960s. The last couple of chapters, we're looking at the 1950s, which again kind of went from like 1945 to 1963, what we call the 1950s, which was this time of kind of perceived tranquility, this kind of perceived conformity, this kind of perceived shared affluence, shared prosperity, shared peace, right? But one of the things I mentioned when we talked about that is actually a lot of the stuff that's going on in the 1950s. There's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of problems that are just kind of being repressed. And then what we're going to see in the 1960s is those things are going to kind of explode, right? Like if somebody kind of tries to bottle in their anger and say, "No, I'm not mad. Everything's good. Everything's perfect," and then all of a sudden something happens and they snap and it sets them off and they just explode. It's kind of what happens in the 1960s. The 1960s is a very different decade than the 1950s. It's a time of a lot of turmoil. It's very contentious. Just a lot of kind of society kind of in upheaval, right? And as we'll see, a lot of that upheaval and a lot of that contentiousness and a lot of that conflict is going to end up kind of hampering this kind of liberal era, right? That's kind of what's going to drag down this liberal era and lead to, as it says here in the title of the chapter, a conservative rebirth, which we'll begin to see in the 1970s, but we won't really see in its full capacity until the 1980s. But we will kind of see the dwindling down of this liberal era. First, it kind of gets to its apex at the beginning of the 1960s, and then it kind of dwindles down as the 1960s wear on, and the kind of chaos and craziness of the 1960s, like I said, kind of torpedoes this liberal project. So that's basically what this chapter is all about. The 1960s, how crazy the 1960s are. So if you remember, the analogy I gave of the 1950s is that it felt very much like a backyard barbecue where old Grandpa Eisenhower's flipping burgers on the grill and everybody's sitting around having a good time, drinking their drink of beverage. The kids are splashing around in the pool, having fun. It just seems like a real nice, calm, easygoing time where everybody's getting along and everything is fine, right? But what we don't really see at that point at 2 o'clock in the afternoon is that, Susie and Trisha are talking to each other and seemingly get along, but they actually hate each other's guts because, Susie thinks that Trisha's daughter, didn't deserve to have the lead in the play because her daughter did or whatever at the school. And Bill and Tom are chatting over there and laughing and seemingly have a good time chatting about the game last night. But actually, Bill and Tom hate each other because Bill's dog always poops on Tom's lawn and Tom's leaves always fall on whatever stupid neighborhood conflicts that people have. So all that drama is kind of under the surface, but everybody's just getting along and having a good time. That's the 1950s. Well, the 1960s is if you fast forward and now it's 11 o'clock at night, all the kids have gone to bed. Everybody's like 11 drinks deep. And now everybody's yelling about each other's daughters being untalented and your dog keeps pooping on my lawn. They're flipping tables over and they're throwing, lawn furniture into the pool. And old Grandpa Eisenhower went home a long time ago. Nobody's flipping burgers on the grill anymore. And all of those kind of underlying issues that they had kind of just repressed earlier in the day have now kind of come out in the open. So that's essentially what we're looking at in the 1960s. What we thought was a nice tranquil time in the 1950s actually had a lot of conflict under the surface, and now it's bubbling up and kind of exploding in the 1960s. So that's the analogy. Chapter 28, the uncivil wars, liberal crisis, and conservative rebirth. The 1960s is a mad, mad, crazy time. Let's get into it. Part one, liberalism at high tide. Before we start to see things unravel, before we start to see things fall apart, we will see kind of the pinnacle of liberalism of this kind of 30-year-long period at the beginning part of the 1960s. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about John F. Kennedy. We talked about Kennedy in a few different ways already. We talked about him briefly as a Cold War president. We talked about him briefly and his kind of reaction to civil rights. But let's talk about him a little bit more broadly. JFK, if you talk to anybody from my parents' generation, is very well regarded. He's this person that a lot of people look on with a lot of reverence, and a lot of people hold in have very high opinions about. And it's interesting actually, because if you look at his record, he didn't actually accomplish very much. He was only president for less than 3 years, and that's not his fault. He was assassinated, but he was president for fewer than 3 years. And yeah, he kind of proved people wrong in the Cold War. He was impressive in a couple of the Cold War things he did with Cuba and such. He did start to talk about civil rights after some of the stuff that had happened that we discussed last chapter, kind of forced it upon him. He kind of started talking about how we need to do more for civil rights. The bigger thing about Kennedy was what he represented. He was a very young president. Many people thought he was very good looking. He had a young wife who was very good looking and very stylish. They had two young kids, and they kind of just seemed to represent the way that America felt about itself during this time period. In the aftermath of World War II, I mentioned this in a previous lecture, America felt like a very young country. We had the baby boom. We had this everybody moving out to the suburbs. So there's millions of family across America who are living in their nice, clean suburban lifestyle in their homes with a two-car garage, and they got a couple of kids running around. And they look at the Kennedys and they very much see themselves, especially after someone like Eisenhower, who everybody loved, but he felt like everybody's grandpa. People identified with the Kennedys. They saw themselves in the Kennedys. The Kennedys were very much this kind of celebrity couple. He was young, he was inspirational, he was glamorous, and he made the country feel like they could accomplish great things. He captured the mood of the country in a way where everybody. He said, "We're at the beginning of what is a remarkable moment in history." Right? He started this. I don't know if he started it, but he I guess he did the space program, and talking about how we're going to go to the moon, and how America is going to lead the world in peace and prosperity, and how this new kind of general lifestyle and standard of living in America that's captured in the suburbs proves that we have better off than anybody else in the history of time. And the American people just felt exuberant and enthusiastic and inspired by Kennedy. And so this is why a lot of people from that generation still look back at him as being one of the greatest presidents we've ever had. Now, again, if you were to look at it from like a cold, hard look and say, what did he accomplish? There's no way you'd be anywhere near one of the greatest presidents we've ever had. Again, he was only president for a little bit less than 3 years. Because, very sadly, in November of 1963, he will be assassinated as he drives through the city of Dallas. He and his wife, and I think the governor, the mayor of Dallas, or the governor of Texas, I can't remember which one, and others were on a kind of a parade going through Dallas, Texas, and they were in a convertible. And someone shot and killed the president in the convertible right next to his wife. And it was caught on video. It was one of the very first kind of like home cameras that someone can have, and they were there that day, and they caught it on camera, and it just was this huge gut punch to the entire nation. This general feeling of euphoria and exuberance and energy and limitless possibilities that the United States felt in the aftermath of World War II from 1945 to 1963 was this time of it seeming like we're getting richer and richer, more and more prosperous, more and more powerful. The possibilities are opening up more and more. It seemed like, again, it seemed like our options and the possibilities were limitless. And then all of a sudden, this young president that kind of personified that entire feeling is shot and killed. Suddenly, the entire nation just felt like it got punched in the gut, and all of that exuberance and all of that energy and all of that excitement really just got cut short, and it left the country feeling this great sense of dread, and just kind of a dark cloud kind of settled in over the nation. But what happens next is actually pretty interesting, especially if you look back at it. His vice president, who we've already talked about last chapter, we talked about pretty extensively, was a man named Lyndon Johnson from Texas. And Johnson and Kennedy actually didn't get along all too well, but they were president and vice president. And Johnson is the exact opposite of Kennedy in every imaginable way. He is not glamorous. He is not young and good looking and exciting and all this other stuff. He's not, Kennedy's from Boston, or from Massachusetts anyway. LBJ's from Texas. And so what people see in Kennedy, then you look at LBJ and it looks like, oh man, like this is a huge letdown from this kind of youthful leader that represents all this exuberance. But in reality, they're actually opposites in a different way too, which is that in many ways, Kennedy was all sizzle and no steak, right? In other words, he talked a big game and he made people feel good, and he made it seem like he was, leading this nation. But again, he didn't actually accomplish very much. On the other hand, Lyndon Johnson, who's, not anybody's idea of sexiest man alive or whatever, or is not all that charismatic, or any of those things, is really, really good at politics. He was in Congress for a very long time, and he, as a congressman, was very good at knowing exactly how to get people to vote the way he wanted them to, knowing who he needed to kind of compliment, who he needed to bully, who he needed to make sure you found something for them that make them be able to get a win for their constituents, whatever. So it's interesting. Lyndon Johnson's going to come in and he's going to accomplish an amazing amount, just a dizzying amount, as president, especially as compared to Kennedy. And yet now we often look back and there's this reverence for Kennedy, and not really a whole lot of people talk about or give that much credit to Johnson. And there's some good reasons for that we'll get to later on in the lecture as well. But Lyndon Johnson's going to come in, and almost immediately he's going to start getting things accomplished, big things accomplished. We already talked about what he accomplished when it comes to civil rights. That one of the things he did immediately after Kennedy's assassination, immediately after he was sworn in, was basically use the tragedy of Kennedy's assassination to say, and the grief that the nation was feeling, to kind of redirect that grief towards action and say Kennedy was, moving forward on civil rights, and the best way for us to honor him is to actually get these things done. So he worked with Dr. King, he worked with others in order to make sure that they could pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There's actually another Civil Rights Act that's not listed here, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which is also known as the Fair Housing Act, which eliminated all those kind of, we talked about previously, all those rules in the suburbs that said you can't sell homes to Black people and so on and so forth, to try to create equality and equity within housing. So we've already talked about Lyndon Johnson. Other than Lincoln and Grant, did more to advance African American rights in this country than any president ever, before or since. I mean, significant accomplishments in order to push forward the rights of African Americans. I will also say, because it's important to note, that he was at his heart a politician. And so while he wanted to do the right thing, if he believed that it would hurt him politically, he may not have done it. So he was really good at understanding what he wanted to accomplish and do the right thing, but also wanted to make sure that it was good for him politically. Okay, so that's that's 1/3 of Lyndon Johnson's legacy. Lyndon Johnson is kind of 3 different pieces to his legacy, and 2/3 of them are really, really good. And 1/3 of them is really bad, and then kind of tanks the other 2. So 1/3 of Lyndon Johnson's legacy is all the things he was able to accomplish in with regards to civil rights. The other part of his legacy, and this next slide is going to be overwhelming, so I'm giving you a heads up, is something called the Great Society. There are a lot of words on this slide. There's a lot of stuff going on this slide. So what you need to understand about the Great Society is that Lyndon Johnson very much thought of it as the second piece of the New Deal. So when we talked before about how the basic conversation post FDR was anybody who wanted to eliminate the New Deal or tear it down was, again, kind of a political pariah. There were people who either wanted to maintain it or expand it. And up until this point, whether it was Truman, Eisenhower, or JFK, people were pretty much okay with just keeping the New Deal. Lyndon Johnson comes in, he says, no, we're going to double down. We're going to bring a sequel to the New Deal. We're going to do even more. And one of the important thing to understand about Lyndon Johnson is that he was a very close ally with Lyndon Johnson. When Lyndon Johnson was president, Lyndon Johnson was a very close ally with FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. When Franklin Roosevelt was president, Lyndon Johnson was in Congress, and he was kind of FDR's right-hand man. He was the guy that was pushing, as I said before, very good at politics, pushing and pulling and cajoling and haranguing and negotiating in order to get a lot of the New Deal pieces of legislation passed. So then when Lyndon Johnson becomes president a couple decades down the road, he says, let's keep going. Let's get even more done. We're only halfway there. He referred, and this, I know every time I say this in class, people kind of squirm a little bit because it does sound a little uncomfortable, but you got to remember he's from Texas and people talk differently in Texas. He referred to Lyndon Johnson, or LBJ, referred to Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, as his political daddy. He said FDR is his political daddy. He had a quote one time he was driving around when he was president, he was in a car with a staffer, and they saw some people who were on the street who were, homeless or poor or something like that. And he turned to his staffer and he said, "Never forget the meek and the humble and the lowly, because President Roosevelt never did." So he very much saw his goal as to extend the New Deal. The New Deal was only halfway there. That yes, we got out of the Great Depression, but now let's just end poverty. Let's eliminate poverty. He believed that he could, through a series of government actions, end poverty. So this is fully in line with this kind of idea of liberalism that I said reigned supreme from 1932 to 1968, which fundamentally believes that the government is the single greatest tool to bring the most good to the most people. He believed that the government could be used to eliminate poverty. So he created something he called a war on poverty. And I'm going to go through quite a few programs here. And so we'll probably be on the slide for a little bit more than a minute. A lot of the programs that were created under Lyndon Johnson's presidency are things that still exist today. So first thing he did was pass the Economic Opportunity Act, and that created a few different programs. One is Head Start, which basically provided free preschool for poor kids. Preschool is not free. Preschool costs money, and it's actually quite expensive. I know from personal experience. But if you are too poor to be able to afford preschool, then you just start your kid in kindergarten. And there's a billion studies that show if you go to preschool before you go to kindergarten, chances are you're going to do far better in kindergarten and then far better in first, second, third, all the way through. That if you get a good head start, then that is going to set you off and put you off in much better footing as you go through education for the rest of your life. I'll also remind you that Lyndon Johnson was a teacher before he was a politician, so he very much focuses on education. So he says it shouldn't be right that poor kids don't get that opportunity. So we'll create a program called Head Start that says if you make below a certain amount of money, the government will pay if you go to preschool. That program still exists today. Another part of the Economic Opportunity Act was job training programs like Job Corps and Upward Bound that basically said, hey man, if you want a job, but you don't have specific skills to be able to go get a job in a factory, to go do this kind of job or that kind of job, we will have government programs that are either very cheap or free, where you can go and take classes and learn new skills. And then that will set you up to go and be able to get to have an opportunity to go and get these jobs that are good paying jobs in factories, using the skills that you learn from these programs. Job Corps and Upward Bound still exists today. They also approved development funds for impoverished areas. We remember after white flight and all the white people moved to the suburbs, there was a huge negative impact on the cities. There wasn't as much investment in the cities as there was in the suburbs. A lot of the people of color who were left behind in the cities got jobs that weren't as good paying jobs as the white people who went out to the cities. So we have a lot of economic depression in the cities. And so they approved government funds to be able to go and try to rebuild some of the parts of the cities that have kind of gone into disrepair, to try to put money into those areas to make sure they're not as run down, and they can try to bring some economic life, not just in cities but in rural areas too. There's a lot of rural areas where people are still suffering. And the picture on the bottom right, that's Lyndon Johnson as president of the United States, kneeling down just talking to a farmer on the porch of his farm with his 3 sons. That's a place that Lyndon Johnson would have been very comfortable since he grew up on a farm in Texas. Beyond the Economic Opportunity Act, he also passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which just provided a ton of money from the federal government for elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools to rebuild facilities, to pay teachers, to buy resources. Again, the fundamental belief that investing in education is a huge piece to helping people rise up out of poverty is not a surprising thing coming from someone who was a teacher before they were a politician. They also passed the Higher Education Act, which gave a lot more funding to universities. So universities will be able to expand. Universities will be able to get more resources, more investment into research, and so on and so forth. They also created Medicare and Medicaid, which are two healthcare programs that you qualify for if you are below a certain income level or under the poverty line. And so FDR had tried to get a healthcare proposal passed universal health care proposal passed and failed, but got some stuff done for people who are living in poverty. Lyndon Johnson also attempts a universal health care proposal, which he doesn't successfully do. But he does expand certain programs that exist and create new programs like Medicare and Medicaid, which basically say if you don't have a job, or if your job doesn't provide health benefits, or if whatever the amount of money you're making doesn't give you enough money to be able to pay for health benefits, you can't afford to go to a doctor, the government will pay for you to be able to go and see a doctor. Nobody should be denied medical attention simply because they are too poor to afford medical attention. The Great Society also expanded the Environmental Protection Program to make sure that we are reducing pollution into air and water. It established a new department in the federal government called Housing and Urban Development. This was about kind of doubling back down on those development funds for impoverished areas, making sure that there are government subsidies for people who have a hard time being able to afford rent. So there's people who may make enough, based on the amount of money they make, they're spending 50, 60, 70, 80% of the amount of money they make just on rent. And so that doesn't leave much money to buy food for their kids or pay for utilities or so on and so forth. So organizations like the Housing and Urban Development focused on building low-income housing or giving subsidies to people so that they can afford rent, so on and so forth, try to keep people in their homes and make sure that they could feed their kids, clothe their kids, pay to keep the lights on, keep the heat on in the wintertime. They passed new child safety laws. They passed new consumer protection laws. He created the National Endowment for the Arts, which funds PBS. And so you would not know what Sesame Street is if it was not for Lyndon Johnson. There would be no such thing as Sesame Street because that came about through the National Endowment for the Arts. And this is a significant a piece of legislation or a series of pieces of legislation which they reformed immigration laws. You may remember back in the 1920s under the presidency of, it either would have been Harding or Coolidge, I can't remember which one, they passed the the Immigration Quota Act, I think it's called, something like that. But that was in which we talked about how they dramatically reduced the number of immigrants they would allow to come to the United States from a whole bunch of countries, mostly Eastern European countries, Asian countries, and Latin American countries. And so we talked about how there's only a couple, I only know of 4 times in American history in which a piece of legislation was passed to restrict immigration. The first one was in the 1790s, which were the Alien and Sedition Acts. The next one was in the 1880s, in which the Chinese Exclusion Act. The next one was in the 1920s, which dramatically reduced the number of immigrants who could come into the United States. And the fourth one was in 2016 or 2017 with what was generally known as the quote unquote Muslim ban, where we restricted immigration from Muslim countries. But anyway, we're focused on the Immigration Act of 1924. So that stayed on the books all the way until the 1960s, and Lyndon Johnson's immigration laws completely undid all of that. So for many people in this class, in my classes across my 10 years teaching, and people it's a direct result of these immigration laws that many people we know were able to come here, because it dramatically increased the number of people who come here from Central America, South America, Latin America. It dramatically increased the number of people who come here from Southeast Asia. It dramatically increased the number of people who come here from Eastern Europe. So if you know anybody whose family immigrated here after 1960, after the 1960s, or in the late 1960s, later 1960s, and they came from Latin America, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, there's a pretty good chance that they would not have been able to immigrate here if it had not been for these immigration laws that were passed by Lyndon Johnson that overturned those kind of nativist immigration laws that restricted immigration in the 1920s. So, deep breath. It's a lot. The Great Society is a lot, just like the New Deal was a lot. And this actually is only the tip of the iceberg. These are just the most consequential pieces of legislation. But the New Deal did a significant amount to help us kind of scratch our way through the Great Depression. And then we got out of it with all of the government spending in World War II. And now Lyndon Johnson wants to eliminate poverty. And while he does not fully eliminate poverty, the number of people living below the poverty line before the Great Society was about 25%, about a quarter of Americans lived below the poverty line. After the Great Society, we'll see that drop down to about 11%. So we go from 25% of Americans, 1 in every 4 who live in poverty, to pretty close to 1 in every 10 live in poverty. So this is a huge, huge, huge package of legislation that has significant impacts on actually reducing poverty and addressing these issues. And more than almost any other impact was reducing poverty among seniors. That was already kind of in the works when it came to Social Security and some of the other stuff from the New Deal. And a lot of the programs that were included in the Great Society doubled down on that, because the group of people who had the largest percentage living in poverty prior to the New Deal and the Great Society were the elderly. And now programs through those, that's going to dramatically reduce those numbers. So this is the second part of the legacy of Lyndon Johnson. The first part is significant civil rights legislation. The second part is the Great Society, which significantly reduces the amount of poverty. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, JFK gets a lot of attention because of kind of what he represented and because of his enthusiasm, or his, I should say, his charisma and his good looks and so on and so forth. But he didn't really accomplish all that much. Lyndon Johnson, on the other hand, doesn't get a whole lot of attention. And again, we'll talk about the third piece of his legacy in a moment, which helps to explain why. But he accomplished an enormous amount, comparable to what FDR did. And so this is, again, why this section is called liberalism at high tide. That was called, yeah. This is the pinnacle of this kind of liberal era, right? And so there's a fundamental, it is rooted, deeply rooted in the fundamental belief that it's the government's job to be able to address society's problems and try to create the greater good for the greatest number of people. Now, it always should be noted, all of those things cost money. The government doesn't have a bunch of money trees just sitting around in some field somewhere. All of those things cost money. So anytime somebody makes the argument that we should dramatically expand the government, that the government should spend a whole bunch of money on all these programs, so on and so forth, let's always remember that all those things cost money. And where does the government get its money from? Taxes. So you have two options. You can either spend, if you're the government, you could spend you have two options if you want to spend money. You can either spend a whole bunch of money and not raise taxes, and that creates a huge debt, or you could spend a whole bunch of money and raise taxes, and that takes money out of people's pockets. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can go about taxing people. Most people suggest you just tax the people who are very rich and you don't tax the middle class and the poor nearly as much, et cetera, et cetera. But there wasn't really a lot of the increasing of taxes during this time period. What Lyndon Johnson was hoping is, because the economy is doing so well and because businesses are doing so well, that tax money is going to increase naturally because of that and be able to pay for these things. But as much as we acknowledge and celebrate that the Great Society had massive positive impact on society as far as not eliminating, but dramatically reducing poverty and providing a bunch of programs to help people who are living in poverty be able to get a step up, we also have to recognize that if you don't have a tax base to pay for those things, it can cause national debt, which could have repercussions down the road. So that's worth noting. All right. The civil rights movement started in the 1950s, went to the 1960s, had significant impacts, obviously not only on actually accomplishing things for the African-American community, but it also inspired a series of other movements that will come in the 1960s. So one of the hallmarks of the 1960s is there is a ton of kind of popular movements, a ton of movements for rights, or we'll talk later on, against the Vietnam War and so on and so forth. So I used to teach with a teacher who was who was a teenager during the 1960s, and in the Bay Area, and he told me that was just what people did socially. There were so many marches and protests every single day that you talk to your friends and be like, so what do you want to do today? You want to go to the anti-war protest or the civil rights protest or the, this protest or that? It was just, that was what you did if you were a young person. There were so many organizations that were coming about that were speaking out about aspects of society they didn't like. So the 1960s, after the civil rights movement basically kind of opens up this gateway for all kinds of other groups of people to say, yeah, us too. Like African Americans accomplished some pretty significant things with the civil rights movement, and basically by saying we're going to refuse to be treated as second class citizens. We're going to push back. We're going to accomplish these things. And so what we'll see is women will say, yeah, us too. And people in the Latino community will say, yeah, us too. And people in the Native American community will say, yeah, us too. And people in the LGBTQ community will say, yeah, us too. So basically what you'll see is this kind of Pandora's box open up of all these different movements and all these different organizations and all these different protests and marches that are going to come out in the 1960s, which is very much, again, kind of this liberalism at high tide, right? Like all of these groups of people saying, you know, we're going to stand up and fight for our rights and our equality and our dignity as well. But it does give an older generation a sense of unraveling, that society is coming apart. So we'll kind of start to see this generational divide happen where the older generation, those who all fought in World War II and moved out to the suburbs and had kids, now their kids are growing up and they're teenagers and or high school students and college students, and they're saying that society that you thought was so great, that society that you thought was so wonderful in the 1950s, actually it wasn't for a lot of people. We're going to speak up against that. And so an older generation is going to feel very much as though this perfect society they had in the 1950s is unraveling, while a younger generation is basically coming and saying, we're just getting started as far as pointing out and acknowledging, exposing a lot of these problems. So one of those groups, of course, is women's rights organizations. And we talked a couple chapters about with suburbanization that there's this kind of growing tension for women as more and more women go into the workplace, and yet the demands of kind of the cult of domesticity and of motherhood and of being a housewife, those remain. And we see more and more women kind of getting crushed between the expectations that they're supposed to be in charge of the domestic sphere, while also saying, well, we want to challenge these separate spheres. We want to go out into the public space. We want to go have jobs. We want to be able to run for office and get elected to office and speak out, and so on and so forth. So as we said before, some of the statistics we talked about, by 1970, more and more women are working outside the home than ever before. 40% of married women, 30% of mothers are working outside the home. And this kind of brings this new kind of stage of women's rights. New organizations like the National Organization for Women, or NOW, is going to push for equality. I will also remind you, one of the major accomplishments that they will get is the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which basically says you can't pay a man and a woman different wages for doing the same job. All the way through history, it was always assumed that if a woman had a job, she wasn't the primary breadwinner. She wasn't the person paying the bills. Her job was just to augment how much money her husband made. So the justification was always, even if she's doing the same job as a man, she doesn't need to get paid as much as a man. So there were, across all industries, women got paid significantly less, usually like a quarter or a third of the amount that men got paid for doing the same job. Well, the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963. We know that all these years later, we still have a problem in our country in which women are not paid the same amount for doing the same work that men are. We're still trying to overcome that hurdle. But the Equal Pay Act made some significant progress in the 1960s. And like I said, we're still working on that one as a society, but at least there was some progress made back then. I'll remind you, in the 1920s, after women got the right to vote, they pushed for an amendment to the Constitution, which basically said that men and women are equal. It's called the Equal Rights Amendment, that men and women are equal, period. That was pretty much it, that there would be no discrimination on gender. It did not pass in the 1920s. It was brought back in the 1950s. It did not pass in the 1950s. It's going to be brought back again during this time period. Still, it will not pass. So there's these movements pushing for these things, and they all kind of reflect these changing social norms that we talked about. Fertility rate is going to drop from 3.6 in 1960 to 2.0 in 1970. So that's basically the average number of children that a woman has in 1960 was 3.6, so somewhere between 3 or 4 kids. And a decade later, it'll be 2. So this is the end of the baby boom. And we already talked about a big piece of that is that birth control is going to be approved and become widely available. So people don't have to have they have the option of being able to do the thing that gets you a baby without actually having to have the baby. And so, and a lot more women are going to say, well, I don't want to have that many kids. I want to be able to have my kids and love them and take care of them, but also be able to go to work and all that other stuff, right? It's not this expectation that you're basically a stay-at-home mom and so on and so forth. And again, it's not that there's this sense that you know uh, that it's insulting to be a stay-at-home mom or anything like that, or that feminists are out here, or these women's rights organizations are out here saying that people shouldn't be a stay-at-home mom, but it's that people should have the option. If you want to be a stay-at-home mom, you can be. If you want to go to work, you should be able to do that as well. But we do see these changing social norms. Divorce rate's going to jump from 22% in 1960 to 48% in 1975. Now, we're not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. You could see it both ways. So obviously, a lot of people don't cheer on divorce as a good thing. However, there are a lot of women who are stuck in marriages that they felt were abusive and didn't necessarily have the right, or at least the social norms kind of made it a little bit of a taboo to file for divorce as a woman or to be a divorced woman. So the fact that we see these numbers of divorces increasing, obviously we'd all hope that all marriages are great marriages and people could stay together. But the reality of it the reality is that that's not the case in many cases, and many women were kind of stuck in marriages that they felt were abusive or neglectful. And so the increase in the rising divorce rate again kind of speaks to these changing social norms. It gets us out of this cult of domesticity, out of this idea that women's job is to be at the home taking care of the kids. Another statistic that further exemplifies that idea is that in 1970 women made up 42% of the college population. Today women make up a majority of the college population. A very popular book that came out in the 1960s or 70s was a book called The Feminine Mystique, written by a woman named Betty Friedan. And of course, it's a big, long book with a lot of words, but this one sentence right here kind of captures the entire thing. The feminine mystique has succeeded in burying millions of American women alive. The feminine mystique is basically just another way of saying this cult of domesticity, another way of saying Republican motherhood, another way of saying separate spheres. So what she's saying is this idea that a woman's job is to be a stay-at-home mom, to be a housewife, and to not have any other hopes or dreams or desires beyond that. And that she's saying that basically that millions of women have felt trapped by that reality, and they have been buried alive. And now in the 1960s and 70s, we see people pushing back against that and opening up, again, inspired by the civil rights movement. Okay, part two is going to take us back to more of a foreign policy, but also is going to have huge implications on domestic. So I told you before that there's kind of three parts to Lyndon Johnson's legacy. Part one is civil rights and some significant accomplishments. Part two is a great society and some significant accomplishments. Fortunately, part three is going to be how he handles the Vietnam War, which is going to be abysmally terrible. He's going to do an awful job with the Vietnam War. And that really is in large part why people don't really like to give him a lot of credit for the things he did, because how bad of a job he did with the Vietnam War kind of eclipses that, and that kind of becomes his legacy, is how poorly of a job he did with the Vietnam War. So let's remind ourselves really quick what's going on in Vietnam. This slide has a lot of the same stuff that you've seen on previous ones. We've been goofing around in Vietnam since the 1950s, right? In the aftermath of World War II, we talked about how there was this decolonialization, how all these European countries were basically kind of giving freedom to all of their colonial holdings. And that included when the French basically told Southeast Asia, like, okay, you guys, you have your freedom now. You can be your own new independent nation. And that created the nations of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and others. Vietnam was going to be divided into Northern Vietnam and Southern Vietnam. Very quickly, Northern Vietnam becomes associated with China and the Soviets and goes to communism. And this creates something called the domino theory of the United States. This is during Eisenhower's administration, which basically said if one country falls, it dramatically increases the likelihood that another country will fall, which dramatically increases the likelihood that another country will fall, and all these neighboring countries one by one will fall. So we cannot let even one country fall to communism, because it's going to, set off this domino effect. And so when North Vietnam became communist, Eisenhower in the 1950s sent quote unquote military advisors to help the South Vietnamese to make sure that they didn't fall victim to communism and to the threat of Chinese and Soviet backed North Vietnamese influence. And the number of military advisors is going to increase under Kennedy's administration. And when Lyndon Johnson becomes president, we see it go from just military advisors to full-on troops, and the number of troops in Vietnam is going to rise rapidly year by year after he becomes president of the United States. And take a look at this quote from Lyndon Johnson. "I'm not going to lose Vietnam. I'm not going to be the president who saw Southeast Asia go the way that China went." You may remember 3 or 4 chapters ago, we were talking about Truman, and Truman did not send troops to China. He only sent money, and the Chinese government fell to the communist revolution. And I told you at that point, this is going to influence presidents for decades to come. People will remember that Truman made the mistake of not sending the military. And it's exactly what I'm talking about. Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, 20 years down the road, remembers what, actually even more than that, 30 years down the road, is going to, no, 20. Anyway, is going to remember what happened to Truman and say, I'm not going to let that happen to me. I'm not going to let all of Southeast Asia fall to communism. I'm not going to let that happen on my watch. So he starts to invest a lot more resources and send a lot more troops in the South Vietnam in order to make sure that it does not fall to communism. And what basically allows him to do this is something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So let's talk about what's going on with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So what happened with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was that as the Americans continue to add more and more military personnel, more kind of military equipment to South Vietnam, one of those things included a naval presence in the Gulf of Tonkin. You can see the Gulf of Tonkin over here is, basically right next to North Vietnam. So there's a bunch of American naval ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. Well, one day there's some missiles fired at American boats in the Gulf of Tonkin by the North Vietnamese. And we all know what happens when people try to mess with our boats. So yet again, we see people messing with our boats. And yet again, that basically gives the United States the enthusiasm toward the war. So Lyndon Johnson and his advisors went to Congress and said, yo, they're firing at our boats. You should give me the power to be able to engage in war activities with the North Vietnamese because they're becoming more belligerent, more aggressive. Congress voted to approve the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and that gave Lyndon Johnson unlimited authority to conduct war in Vietnam. Now, an important side note is there is no evidence whatsoever that any missiles were actually fired at our boats. That was something that was a rumor, and based on that rumor, that Congress gave Lyndon Johnson unlimited authority to conduct war in Vietnam, which was a huge giveaway by Congress because there's supposed to be a balance between what the president does and what Congress does when it comes to war. The Congress is basically handing over all of its power, all of its constitutional power when it comes to making decisions about war to the president. And it was based on a rumor of something that didn't actually happen. So there was actually no Gulf of Tonkin incident. It was made up. However, it did lead to a very real Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And we see once Lyndon Johnson gets full authority over the Vietnam War, things are going to escalate quickly. In 1965, the first troops will be sent into Vietnam. Now, remember, quote unquote military advisors have been there for quite some time. So we've already had our military there at a very low, kind of limited, in a very limited way. But now we're really going to start to open it up. So in 1965, the first troops arrive. In 1966, the number of troops in Vietnam are 380,000. In 1967, the number of troops are 485,000. In 1968, the number of troops are 536,000. So you can see the number of troops in Vietnam are increasing rapidly year by year after Lyndon Johnson gets the authority to do so. He also approved something called Operation Rolling Thunder, in which American naval jets and planes will fly over North Vietnam and just drop an absolute shocking number of bombs on Vietnam. In fact, there are twice as many bombs that will be dropped on North Vietnam than were dropped the entirety of World War II combined. All of the fighting in World War II and the number of bombs dropped in World War II, which took place across multiple continents. There will be more bombs dropped just on North Vietnam during this conflict. Um, and so we can see, yes, that Lyndon Johnson did very much escalate the activity and the military presence of the United States in this conflict between the North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese, which fundamentally is a civil war between the North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese that the United States is engaging itself in under the continued flag of containment. This is a Cold War conflict, right? And as you can see on the top of this slide, it says it's a Cold War trap. I think many people thought we'll have the same, this whole thing kind of sounds a lot like Korea, which we fought in the 1950s, which was kind of celebrated as a success for the United States. It has a general feel. You have a northern part that's fallen to communism. You have a southern part that has not yet. The northern part is supported by the Chinese and the Soviets. The southern part is backed by the United States. We sent in troops to South Korea. We pushed back the North Korean troops, eventually got a peace agreement in which North Vietnam and South Vietnam were split with relatively low casualties, and it didn't really take all that much time. So I think there was this assumption that something similar would happen here in Vietnam, but it absolutely does not. It is a trap, and it lasts much longer than Korea does. Many more troops will be sent, many more troops will be killed, and there will not be a clear victory for the United States by the time this is over. As we will see, as the number of troops continue to increase and the years kind of drag on, popular support for the war is going to diminish. If you look at the percentage of Americans that think sending troops to Vietnam was a mistake, in August of 1965, about a quarter of the Americans said we should not be sending troops to Vietnam. In 1966, that increases to 31. In 1967, that increases to 47. In 1968, that increases to 54. So by the time we get to 1968, if I go back to the previous slide, the year where we've gotten up to 536,000 troops, a majority of Americans now think it was a bad idea to send the troops. By the time we pull out of Vietnam in January of 1973, a full 60% of the American public will think it was a bad idea to have sent troops to Vietnam. Now, if you go back to the early days, August or 1965, 66, 67, when it was still a minority of Americans who thought it was a bad idea to send troops, most of those people are going to be young people. Most of those people are going to be college students, and we will see a very active anti-war protest begin to emerge during this time period. Yet again, inspired by the civil rights movement. We saw how successful the civil rights movement was when it came to nonviolent direct action. And now we've seen other groups employ the same methods. We saw the women's liberation movement, feminist movement, women's rights movement do the same thing. We will see the anti-war movement do the same thing. And so this is what I was talking about before. It seems like every weekend there are massive marches in the streets of Washington, D.C., of New York, San Francisco, of all of the major cities across the United States. But a huge anti-war protest, over 100,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. This, by the way, is 4 years after the 250,000 protesters showed up at the Lincoln Memorial to hear Dr. King give the I Have a Dream speech. So the Lincoln Memorial and Washington, D.C. is becoming more and more this kind of popular target of huge groups of people showing up to protest what's going on in their society. And so, yes, we do see this anti-war sentiment and anti-war protest increasing as the years go on, as the number of troops who go to Vietnam is increasing, and the number of body bags who come back continue to increase. One of the things that starts to happen is on the nightly news, which again, all those people in kind of their sheltered suburban life are being exposed to, because so many people have TVs. On the nightly news, they start a running total where they just list the names of the soldiers who were killed in Vietnam that day or over the last week or so on and so forth. So the toll of the war is really starting to seep into people. They just really see the number of people who are losing their lives in this war. And there kind of becomes this general question of why? What are we doing this for, right? The Cold War started in 1945. By the time we get to 1950, when Korea happens, the Cold War is still very much it feels like a very real thing, a very real threat. This is the generation that came out of World War II, the generation that saw the Soviets kind of begin to exert itself as a global superpower and a challenge to us. By the time we get to the late 1960s, it's, 2 decades beyond when the Cold War started. The Cold War seems as though it's not as kind of present and real of a threat as it once was, and we're sending hundreds of thousands of young men off to die in some jungle in some country that most Americans had not even heard of prior to this. Um, for what? Right? For what? Now, they will say we got to contain the spread of communism, domino theory, all that other stuff. But for most Americans, that doesn't mean anything. All I know is that my coworker's son was just sent off to go fight in this war, or my nephew was go, or the kid that the kid that my son used to play with down the street, or my own son has gone off to fight in this war, and we don't really see the purpose of it. And things become even worse because eventually they're going to have to start implementing a draft, and it's not going to be an all volunteer army. They're going to start drafting people to go off and fight in the war, and that's actually going to become even worse too, because if you are affluent and you are white, you find ways to get around it. So, for example, if you're a college student, you did not, you were not eligible for the draft. And when it came to college students, a vast majority of these were affluent white kids, right? Or you would have your dad's buddy was a doctor, and so he can, make up some medical ailment, like, I don't know, I have like bone spurs in my feet or something, and so I can't go and fight in the war. So you get some kind of medical reason that you can defer the war. So more and more as the war goes on, it becomes a war that's being fought by poor Black and brown young men, um, as opposed to the affluent, the well-off white young men. So it becomes even more of a civil rights issue. Dr. King will start to become a very outspoken critic of the war as this becomes more and more of a reality as well. So what we'll see, again, this younger generation will be the ones that really start to push back against the war, but also kind of society in general. So a new organization will be founded called the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. They call themselves the New Left because even though Lyndon Johnson has obviously created this landslide of new programs that are meant to help people, he is seen as a villain by the younger generation because they really only see him in context of the war. So all of the other things he's accomplished, from civil rights to trying to eliminate poverty, all that stuff is being overshadowed by the war, and he will become a villain of the younger generation of this new left. And they will create something called the Port Huron Statement, in which they kind of lay out their beliefs and what the new left is all about. This will become connected to the very well-known counterculture hippie movement. More and more, there's kind of the younger generation kind of divides into 3 categories. There are a number of young people who are conservative and support the war and are against, the counterculture and movement and stuff like that. So that's a group of people. Then there are young people who engage and march and get involved and push back against the war and demand that society is going to be changed. But there's a whole group of younger people who are so kind of disaffected by everything that they're not trying to get involved in change society. They just say, you know what, I'm just going to drop out of society altogether. And this is kind of the hippie movement. We see drug use skyrocket, kind of the free love, free sex movement, all that kind of stuff skyrocket. Concerts like Woodstock really kind of exemplify this kind of stuff. So that's one portion of it. It's actually, even though that gets a lot of attention in the media, it's actually kind of a small percentage of the people who were kind of high school and college age students, were like that hippie, we're gonna like flower power, drop out, whatever. That gets a lot of attention in the media, but it actually was kind of a small proportion of that generation. A larger part of that generation were those who were actually getting involved. So you see on the right hand side, there's a march there at UC Berkeley, of the free speech movement, because a lot of college campuses started to prohibit war protests on campus. So people would protest against the war, the college campus would prohibit that, and that led to something called the free speech movement, in which a lot of people would protest saying our free speech is being infringed upon. The free speech movement is founded at UC Berkeley, and you can see a lot of people there who definitely do not look like hippies, who definitely do not look like people who are dropping out and wearing tie-dye and doing drugs and going to Woodstock, who are very much involved in pushing for a change in society. But it's important to note, generally speaking, that there's going to be a pretty significant generational gap, that the older generation, by and large, will continue to support the war. The older generation, by and large, is going to be uncomfortable with all of these protests, all these marches, and this feeling that society is unraveling before their eyes, when just 10 years earlier, they thought they had perfected human civilization, and now it seems like everything's unraveling. And a younger generation who grew up in the 1950s knowing that things had not been perfected, knowing that the issues of the 1950s that were kind of held repressed needed to come out, and they're going to push back against those issues. All right, this brings us to part 3. And more specifically, we're going to talk about the year 1968. The year 1968 was a really, really, really bad year in American history. It kind of stands out as being one of the worst individual single years in American history. So we're going to say that 1968 was a terrible, no good, very bad year. It starts in January. And one of the things that's worth noting about the war in Vietnam is, yes, we've seen an increased number of troops sent to Vietnam. Yes, we've seen an increased number of Americans who think it's a bad idea to send troops to Vietnam. And more the American people are questioning why we're over there. But by and large, people didn't question whether or not we were actually winning. Lyndon Johnson and the government and people who talked about such things would say everything's going well, we're winning the war, we're almost through it, just a couple more victories and we'll have won this thing, just stick tight, we're almost there. Okay, we're almost there, we almost got it. Lyndon Johnson kept coming out giving speeches and say, we just need to hold tight, a couple more victories, and we're going to win this thing. We're so close to winning it. And the people just generally believe that. Then on January 30th, 1968, which was a holiday in Vietnam, I don't really know anything about the holiday, but it's called Tet. Something happens that will become known as the Tet Offensive. The Viet Cong, which is the military for the North Vietnamese, the communist military, will attack over 100 different South Vietnamese cities and military outposts, all at once on the same day. At sunrise on January 30th, this giant surprise attack all throughout South Vietnam, in which over 100 cities will be attacked all at the same time. Some of the cities will be overrun and captured. Some of the fighting will be repelled. The city of Saigon, which is the capital of South Vietnam, will be overrun. The Americans will be attacked. The American embassy will be overrun, and people in the embassy will have to flee. It is a overwhelmingly embarrassing moment for the South Vietnamese and for the Americans, because it became abundantly clear all of a sudden in one awful day that America was not winning this thing. That all of the proclamations that we were almost there, that we were winning, were just, a couple of victories away. And the media started paying a lot more attention to the details of the war and started basically conveying to the American people that we are not winning this thing. We are losing this thing. That the United States, which since 1945 had considered itself to be the greatest military power in the world, and then the greatest diplomatic power in the world, and the greatest economic power in the world, was getting beat by the North Vietnamese, which again is a country that most Americans hadn't even heard of 5 or 10 years earlier. So this is a monumentally embarrassing moment, a huge loss, and it really just awoke the country to the reality that we're not winning this thing. And if you look at the numbers, before the Tet Offensive, 56% of the American people supported the war, and 28% were against it. After the Tet Offensive, and this is literally like a poll that was conducted a month before the Tet Offensive and like a month after the Tet Offensive, we go from 42 against to 41 in favor. So we have a majority of the people who are against the war after the Tet Offensive, and it'll never go back. That number is only going to grow, as we saw on a previous slide. Lyndon Johnson continues to be haunted by the war. There are protesters outside the White House every single day that are chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" It is something that wears him down, and he becomes incredibly depressed by the fact that all of the programs that he had created to try to eliminate poverty, all of the stuff he accomplished to try to address civil rights was not getting the attention it deserved, was not getting him the adoration that he felt like he deserved. He's a massive egomaniac, it should be noted, and believed that he should be getting praise for all of those things. And also that Vietnam was becoming such an all-encompassing conflict that was defining the nation, that protests were across the country, that people were increasingly against the war, that he would not actually ever be able to accomplish anything, because this thing was going to continually drag him down. So on March 31st, out of the blue, without warning, March 31st, 1968, Lyndon Johnson announced he will not run for re-election because 1968 is an election year. He became president in 1963 when Kennedy was assassinated. He was elected in 1964, and he can still serve another term, but he decides not to run for election in 1968. This is the first time in American history a sitting president, chose not to run for re-election. Every other president who had an opportunity to run for a second term ran for a second term. Some of them lost. Some of them didn't have that opportunity because they were assassinated or died from other things, but no president had ever said, I'm not going to do this. So again, in this general sense that society is kind of falling apart, unraveling, this idea that the person supposed to be in charge is like, you know what, this is too much for me to handle. I'm out. I can't do this anymore. Yet again is going to lend itself to the what the hell is going on feeling that most Americans have. And I'll remind you that this is directly after a time in which America thought everything was awesome, right? The Lego theme song was the theme song of the 1950s, right? We were the strongest military, the strongest economy, the strongest diplomatic power. Everybody was moving out to the suburbs. Not everybody, but you get it. Everybody had these 2-car garages. Everybody's getting paid a good amount of money. We were literally had perfected human civilization. And now, before you know it, everything is falling apart. There are people marching in the streets about civil rights. There are people marching in the streets about women's rights. There are people marching in the streets against the war. There are people marching in the streets about freedom of speech. All of a sudden, we're losing this war to some small, tiny country on the other side of the planet. And the president of the United States says, I can't do this anymore. I'm out. And this is January, the Tet Offensive of 1968, March of January 1968, and then in April of 1968, things are going to get even worse, because on April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. will be shot and killed in Memphis, Tennessee, assassinated, and this is going to lead to a massive eruption of race riots throughout the United States. Every major city across the United States erupted in racial violence as the African American community was distraught by the news of Dr. King's assassination. And basically, cities were being burned down, police were coming out in force, violence between the African American community and the police in these situations was unfolding all across the nation. And yet again, contributing to this general sense that everything is spinning out of control. That photo you see of Dr. King right there is taken just moments before he shot. He was shot right there on that balcony in a hotel room. If you ever find yourself in Memphis, Tennessee, which I don't know why you would, but if you do, I cannot possibly more highly recommend going to that hotel, which is now a museum. It's a civil rights museum. It's one of the best museums I've ever been to. And I frankly don't even really like museums. I generally think they're boring because I'm not a very intellectual person. But that museum is a phenomenal, phenomenal museum. If you're ever in Memphis, Tennessee, I strongly suggest you go. It is a powerful place. It's not just about the assassinations, about the civil rights movement in general, but the assassination of Dr. King is going to shock the nation, particularly the African American community. There's only one city in the United States that did not erupt in violence, and that was Indianapolis, Indiana. And you might be thinking, well, what? That's weird. Indianapolis, that's a random city to blah, blah, blah. Well, there's actually a story there. After Lyndon Johnson announced he would not be running for president, John F. Kennedy's younger brother, Robert Kennedy, who was the attorney general under Kennedy, announced he would run for president. And Robert Kennedy immediately became an incredibly popular figure. The younger generation beloved Robert Kennedy. So this kind of growing discontent among the younger generation, this anti-war generation, this free speech generation, this generation that supports civil rights and supports women's rights, that is becoming more and more disgruntled with the older Democratic Party, they see their guy in Robert Kennedy. They see an icon, they see a hero in Robert Kennedy. And remember, Robert Robert Kennedy's brother was assassinated in 1963, and his friend, because he became friends with Dr. King, was assassinated in 1968. Well, the night Dr. King was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was actually giving a speech in Indianapolis. And most of the people in Indianapolis hadn't even heard that Dr. King had been assassinated yet, because news didn't travel as fast back then as it does now. So he went to Indianapolis to give his speech, and the police in Indianapolis told him, "We won't give you an escort," because he was going to give a speech on the black side of town, because back then, and still today to a certain degree, there was that white part of town and black part of town. So Robert Kennedy was due to give a speech in the black part of town, and the local police said, "We're not going to take you in there. It's too dangerous. We don't think you should go, because we think there's going to be violence, and we will refuse to take you in there." So Robert Kennedy went to the quote unquote black side of town with just him and a couple of his staffers, and stood in front of the crowd and gave a speech and notified the crowd that Dr. King had been assassinated. This is a recording that exists. You can YouTube it and find out. And you can hear the audible heartbreak that the crowd reacts when they hear that when they hear Robert Kennedy tell the crowd that MLK had been assassinated. Then he goes on to give a speech in which he talks about how it's a moment for constructive action, and that the work of Dr. King would not have wanted to see, this work of nonviolence that Dr. King had committed his life to, would not have wanted to see all of this violence throughout the United States, and that we as a nation need to move forward in a way that's healing and constructive and focused in nonviolence. And a lot of people credit that speech by Robert Kennedy as to why that one city, Indianapolis, was the only major city in the United States that did not have racial violence that night, because of Robert Kennedy. And so now Robert Kennedy, as I said before, is this hero of the younger generation and of the African American community. He is seen as he's the most popular Democratic candidate in 1968 running for president. He's going to clearly win the Democratic convention, and then go on to win the presidency. He will become the next president of the United States. He's going to win the election of 1968. Except that in June of 1968, Robert Kennedy will also be assassinated. And so, yes, things are crazy in 1968. In 1963, JFK was assassinated. In April of 1968, MLK will be assassinated. And in June of 1968, Robert Kennedy will be assassinated in Los Angeles. And you could see the headline of the newspaper that says, "God, not again," which is just the general sense of the country at the time. I mean, how could you feel anything other than just, what the hell is happening, right? And again, just 10 years earlier, imagine what the feeling of most Americans were and where they were in the 1950s, and how they must feel in 1968 in the aftermath of Robert Kennedy's assassination. So the younger generation, which had this, was fueling this candidacy of Robert Kennedy, which was going to put someone in the White House who was against the war, who was pro-civil rights, who was pro-women's rights, who was pro-freedom of speech, who represented this younger generation. They lost their hero, and now the younger generation has nowhere to go but to be disruptive, but to continue to march and protest in an increasingly disruptive way. And then so what we see at the Democratic National Convention in July, I believe it's July of 1968, is, rather than being inside the convention hall celebrating Robert Kennedy winning the candidacy, which is where most of those young people would have been, they're celebrating joyously, celebrating that their guy, Robert Kennedy, was going to be the next president of the United States. Instead, they were outside, this younger generation, these protesters, these activists were outside the convention hall, protesting the Vietnam War and protesting the Democratic Party. City of Chicago, which is where the Democratic National Convention took place, and the state of Illinois sent in law enforcement officials, heavily armed, as though they were going into battle. And you could only imagine, and you could see in the photos, how this ends up. You have the protesters on the left, you have the protesters and the armed military and police officers confronting each other in the middle, and you see the officers arresting and beating protesters. There's on the left. There's video of this that I usually show, and you can go and look at it. That kind of shows the kind of terror that unfolds as the police essentially kind of advance on the protesters, and everybody starts kind of fleeing and running all over the place. But yet again, if you are a suburban, white, 1950s, the America, everything in America is incredible. Living in that world, turn on the news every night and it's assassinations and it's protest and it's turmoil and it's police violence with African Americans and it's police violence with young protesters, and the entire thing very much seems to be falling apart. That's the video. I won't show it here, but you can look it up. So how does the election of 1968 turn out? The Republicans win. And this, as we said before, as I alluded to a number of times, is the official end of this near 40-year era of kind of liberal democratic reign, from FDR in 1932 all the way through Lyndon Johnson, who will be elected in 64, but will not run for re-election in 68. Republican candidate Richard Nixon will win in 1968, and you can see he wins by a pretty significant landslide. In his speech at the Republican National Convention, he says this line: "Tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support." And what he's talking about, he creates this concept of the silent majority. And what he's saying is, what we see on the nightly news all the time is people, Americans, who are disgruntled about civil rights and disgruntled about the war and disgruntled about the free speech, and they're out there and they're protesting and they're causing all these problems, and they're out there and they're doing drugs and all this other stuff. He said they are the loudest group of people, they are getting the most attention, but that is a minority. He said most Americans are sitting at home silently upset about all of this. He talks about the silent majority. He said, I am tired of the anti-war movement. I am tired of the counterculture and the hippies, the dirty hippies, as he called them. I'm tired of all of these urban riots and the civil rights movements. I'm tired of liberal elitism. I'm tired of all these welfare policies. I'm tired of the government spending all this money. I'm tired of the New Deal programs. I'm tired of the Great Society programs. I'm tired that they're taking our tax dollars and giving it to people who just want to loaf around and listen to rock and roll music and smoke dope all day long, and so on and so forth. And he was correct that there is a large percent of the country who felt the exact same way. All of these suburban families who were flipping on their TV, watching the nightly news, were growing increasingly disgusted by what was going on in the United States. And who else can you blame but the people who have been in charge for the last 40 years? This is Lyndon Johnson's fault, Kennedy's fault, Eisenhower's fault, even though he's a Republican, Truman's fault, right? It is the fault of this liberal ideology. And so this is why we see liberalism begin to fall apart. It buckles under the weight of all of these things. So liberalism opened the door to all of these things, which I think most of us would look back on now and say these are good things. The fact that we had a civil rights movement, the fact that we had a women's liberation movement, the fact that we had all these other movements we'll talk more about, and the fact that people were speaking out against the war, and the fact that people were speaking out in favor of free speech. We look back at those, by and large, mostly today, as good things. And that liberalism opened the door for all of that. But in the moment, it was too much, too fast for the people living during that time. And it felt like their perfect little kind of sheltered reality of the 1950s was crumbling, and people were worried about that. So you look at the election of 1944, in which Harry Truman was elected. The last election where FDR was elected, and the election of 1968, which is only 24 years later, you can see how things have changed dramatically. In 1944, obviously, it was a huge victory for Roosevelt, and all the blue states were the Democratic states that voted for Roosevelt. In 1968, 24 years down the road, all the red states voted for Nixon. It should be noted that Nixon created something called the Southern Strategy. At this point in 1968, the South had fully abandoned the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was very obviously, especially after Lyndon Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and then the Fair Housing Act, that the South said the Democratic Party is no longer with us. The South is still the party of segregation and white supremacy. And so Nixon created a strategy called the Southern Strategy, in which he actively recruited, advertised to the Southern states that they should join the Republican Party, that the Republican Party has your best interest at hand. Now, they didn't go about saying we believe in segregation and we believe in white supremacy, but they used kind of coded language. We believe in states' rights. the southern states should be able to do whatever they want without interference from the federal government. Well, if that was true, the southern states would continue to segregate. It's the federal government that were forcing them to desegregate. So you don't say we believe in segregation, vote for us, because the rest of the country won't vote for you. You say we believe in states' rights. There's a whole bunch of other coded language. There's actually, yet again, a recording of the person who worked for Richard Nixon who created this strategy explaining this whole thing. He very much explains the entire thing about how you get the people in the South, the white supremacists and segregation in the South, to vote for you. And you can see that picture in the middle. He says, Dixieland is Nixon land. That picture, that rally where he kind of went down to recruit people, not coincidentally, was in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is where, if you remember from a previous lecture, those 3 young men who were trying to register people to vote were killed by the Ku Klux Klan. So Nixon is very much trying to appeal to that group of people. Now, there will be a third candidate, George Wallace, who runs in 1968, who will win 5 southern states. He's basically in the old Strom Thurmond mode. He is a full-blown segregationist. He was the governor of Alabama who said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So he's outright, George Wallace, advocating for segregation, and 5 southern states vote for him. But in the coded language that Nixon and the Republicans used in 1968, they get quite a few southern states to vote for them as well. And so we see this huge tide being turned where the South has now been kind of locked up by the Republican Party. And what we've seen from that time since 1968, 1972, 1976, 1980, 1984, 88, 92, 96, 2000, 04, 08, 12, 16, and 20, the South votes for the Republican Party. Ever since then, the South has been locked solid in the Republican Party's pocket ever since this 1968 election, in which the Southern strategy was employed by the Republicans to get them over there. And so this is, like I said, officially kind of the end of that liberal era in 1968. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, well, let me not go there yet. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is the rise of conservatism. Nixon actually himself is quite a moderate. He was the vice president under Eisenhower. So he's quite a moderate. We don't really think of him that much. And we have a next lecture. We'll kind of dive into that a little more. He's quite moderate. So we are not yet quite on the ascendancy of conservatism. We'll get to there in 1980. But this is the end of this kind of liberal era. Between 1968 and 1980, we kind of enter into this purgatory where it's not, our country doesn't really know what we are. We're kind of done with liberalism. We have a bad taste in our mouth from everything that unraveled from that, but we haven't really had this kind of enthusiastic champion for conservatism yet. So we're kind of in this middle ground that we'll kind of sift our way through in the next chapter. Other rights movements will continue to be inspired by the civil rights movement. There will be a farm workers movement in California led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, which kind of doubles down as a Latino rights movement because most of the farm workers in the United States on the West Coast are also Latinos. And so we'll see people like Cesar Chavez be inspired by Dr. King. Cesar Chavez is also good friends with Robert Kennedy before he was assassinated. We'll see an American Indian movement. And as part of that movement, they will go out and they will occupy Alcatraz Island. This is after Alcatraz is done being a prison, and before it becomes a tourist attraction, the prison is just kind of abandoned. So a bunch of Native Americans will go out there and reclaim that, and as a symbolic gesture as to how so much of their land was stolen from them, and they're going to steal some land back. A gay rights movement is going to emerge in 1969 after an event known as the Stonewall Riots. It was a pretty common occurrence that police officers in cities throughout the United States would know where kind of the gay bars are, and every once in a while they just kind of go in and violently attack everybody there. One time that happened in New York at a place called the Stonewall Inn, which was a gay bar, and the patrons of the bar fought back, and that fight kind of spilled out into the streets, and it led to a multi-day kind of riot between the police and the gay community in New York. And that kind of, in the same way that we've seen a bunch of other moments, kind of sparked the gay rights movement that's going to emerge in 1969 and continue into the 1970s. Again, all of these movements inspired by the civil rights movement, and again, also growing out of this idea that liberalism opened the door for all these groups of people, and that the civil rights movement opened the door for all of these groups of people to say, yeah, and us too. We have also been discriminated against. We are going to stand up for our rights as well. And so we see a lot of that in the 1960s, which again, we today look back on as a great thing. It was the beginning of a lot of kind of questioning the existing power structures that for most of American history said pretty much if you were white and male and straight, then you could kind of get away with whatever you want. If you're anybody else, then you had a number of obstacles in your way to be able to be successful. In the 1950s and 60s, we really see that power structure challenged in a very real way, which when we look back on it is a good thing. It began a conversation that we're continuing to have today. However, if you're living during that time, and again, if you were a suburban white family that had been sheltered yourself off into the nice quiet suburbs, these types of things made you very uncomfortable and made you feel like society was further unraveling. Further contributing to this idea of the silent majority, further contributing to people, those types of people supporting someone like Nixon, who said, "Let's just kind of calm everything down here, right? Let's just go back to a regular conservative traditional way of doing things." All right, that brings us to part 4, which is quite short. Richard Nixon and the silent majority. This really is actually going to be about Richard Nixon and foreign policy. We'll talk more about Richard Nixon and domestic policy in a future chapter. The Vietnam nightmare continues on. Just because Lyndon Johnson has left does not necessarily mean that the Vietnam is over. It continues on. It only gets worse. Nixon makes things worse before he makes things better. So one of the things that's going on in Vietnam, I'm going to go back a few slides here just to look at a map. There's something called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The military leader of the Viet Cong is a man named Ho Chi Minh, who was the communist leader of North Korea, who also lived and was educated in Boston, and worked at the same hotel that Boston cream pie was invented. Boston cream pie, invented the same hotel that Ho Chi Minh worked at. Anyway, so he created this thing called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This is how the North Vietnamese were able to get access to South Vietnam. They were going through Laos and Cambodia. And so what Nixon did when he became president is he started bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail to try to disrupt the supply line. Now that's a big deal because an American president bombing other countries. There was no authority given to the president to do any kind of military action in Laos or Cambodia. And so he does it secretly. He doesn't tell anybody. So he starts bombing Laos, bombing Cambodia. And when that comes out, it only doubles down people's dismay and frustration at the war. So the war protests get more intense. Nixon is even more kind of aggressive against war protesters than Lyndon Johnson was. War protests turn more and more violent. There's a very sad moment where there's a protest at a college called Kent State in Ohio, in which the National Guard ended up shooting and killing 4 protesters. There's a famous song about that. In fact, I'm sure anybody who knows anything about classic rock knows that there's a bajillion anti-war songs from the 1960s and 70s. It is becoming more and more evident, as I said earlier, that troops are disproportionately poor and minority. The soldiers themselves in Vietnam, who are increasingly drafted into the army, are defying officers and refusing to do certain missions that they think are dangerous or that they think is um, um, overly violent against the local population. And so you start to see the whole military chain of command start to fall apart in Vietnam. A very kind of disturbing event happened called the My Lai Massacre, in which there was some intelligence that a small village in South Vietnam had been taken over by the North Vietnamese, and that they were living there kind of secretly. And so a bunch of American soldiers were sent to that village to basically kill everybody in that village and burn it down, which they did. And it was later found out that the intelligence was bad, and everybody that lived in that village was actually South Vietnamese, and they were not North Vietnamese. And that obviously was a horrifying reality to realize if you were one of the soldiers who killed all those people and burned down their village. But that things like the My Lai Massacre happened more and more frequently, where just the amount of violence and terror that was inflicted not just against the North Vietnamese but also the South Vietnamese was becoming more and more common, and just the entire reality of the war which was becoming an absolute nightmare. And so Nixon decides it's time to end this thing, and he creates a program called Vietnamization, which basically means we're going to hand Vietnam back over to the South Vietnamese. We're going to withdraw our troops. So you can see the number of troops in Vietnam are going to steadily decrease: 543,000 in 1968, 334,000 in 1971, all the way down to 24,000 in 1973. And we're basically going to hand control back over to the South Vietnamese, and we'll continue to give them some kind of financial assistance or whatever. But we're done actually being involved. By the time it's all said and done, 58,000 Americans will have been killed in Vietnam. Over 3 million Vietnamese, North and South, will have been killed in Vietnam. And the United States will have spent over $100 billion in Vietnam. And after the United States basically pulls out, the North Vietnamese pretty much very quickly and easily overrun the South Vietnamese, and South Vietnam falls to communism. So those 58,000 dead Americans, those 3 million dead Vietnamese, and that $100 billion was all a complete waste, because when it's all said and done, South Vietnam falls to North Vietnam and to communism. So the entire thing is a massive embarrassment for a nation who just a couple of decades earlier had defeated Hitler and considered itself to be the global superpower, an unquestionable military force in the world, that had been involved in conflicts all over the world, and yet was completely incapable of achieving victory against the North Vietnamese, which of course were backed by the Chinese and the Soviets as well. But Nixon brings an end to the Vietnam War. Further, he opens up diplomatic relationships with the Soviets and with the Chinese, and achieves something that we call détente. That's what that word means. That's how you say that word, D-E-T-E-N-T-E, détente, which basically says we're not friends, we're not allies, but like this whole fighting each other thing, this is bad for everybody. So he goes and he meets with the leaders of the Soviet Union and agree and come to some agreements that kind of start to pull back on some of the most aggressive parts of the Cold War. He's the first sitting president in American history to go to China and work with the Chinese, trying to open up some economic relationships. So the negotiations that Nixon has with the leader of the Soviets lead to are called the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, which basically is trying to pull back on all of that huge arms race that we had talked about, that Eisenhower had created, this huge arms race where basically both sides had these weapons that could destroy Earth multiple times over. And there's obviously a general feeling that it's not good to have these. So both sides say, we agree to start to dismantle a lot of our big, bad, scary weapons. And they signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, say let's not point missiles at each other anymore. So this is general kind of like cooling down of the Cold War, pun intended, this general cooling down of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and an opening of economic relationships between the United States and China, which again leads to somewhat of a more productive relationship with us. So Richard Nixon on the international stage is a pretty significant figure, brings an end to the Vietnam War after at first making the huge mistake of bombing Cambodia and Laos, and really kind of turns down the tension on the global stage with in between us and the Soviets and us and the Chinese. So that's the end of chapter 28. Overall, what we've seen is this era of liberalism peak with the beginning of Lyndon Johnson's administration, with this dramatic a war on poverty that decreases the amount of Americans living in poverty, with these huge expansion of government programs. Of course, we already talked about the significant accomplishments when it came to the civil rights movement, but that third piece of LBJ's legacy, which is the Vietnam War, really is the kind of piece of concrete that gets tied around his ankle and drags him under. And really, he kind of takes all of liberalism with him, because it is a monumentally unpopular war, and all of the protests against that, in addition to all these other protests in favor of equal rights, lend itself to this overall feeling that America is unraveling and coming apart at the seams. And for a nation of people and a generation of people who felt in the 1950s with their perfect little manicured, sheltered suburban life that America had been, like I said, perfected human civilization, the 1960s were a very disorienting time. And that led them to abandon kind of the liberal project and go towards someone like Richard Nixon as president of the United States. Chapter 29, which will be next, we'll talk more about Nixon's administration, more about the 1970s, and kind of what happens next. But that's chapter 28. If you stayed all the way till the end, congratulations. You win a prize. I don't know what it is, but you win a prize. Thanks for listening, and y'all have a good day. Thanks.